The opposition in Egypt had called for the street protests against President Morsi to continue until he gave up his extended powers and dropped the referendum. These are live shots overlooking the presidential palace in Cairo. You can see it's 7 o'clock in the morning, and you can just make out at least one tank in that picture. Those tanks had been positioned outside the presidential palace earlier in the week after protesters had breached a barbed wire security fence of the presidential palace.
The Republican Guard has beefed up security around the presidential palace, erecting concrete barriers to try and stop the protesters getting closer. All this as the military issued its first political statement since the crisis began 2 weeks ago. It said dialogue is the best and only way to consensus in the interests of the nation and its citizens. Otherwise, we will be driven into a dark tunnel of disastrous consequences, which will not be allowed. The president's move to annul the decree puts the ball firmly in the opposition's court, making him look like he's meeting them halfway. It may also get Egypt's judges back to work to supervise the referendum, as judicial oversight has once again been restored under the new decree. On the surface, then, some concessions from the president, but in reality the deadlock continues and Egypt's political future remains uncertain.
Egypt's vice president, flanked by other notable figures, announced that President Mohamed Morsi has rescinded a controversial decree he issued nearly 2 weeks ago. Today, President Morsi met with members of the opposition in an attempt to defuse the fallout from that decree that granted him temporary but absolute powers. It triggered weeks of protests between supporters and opponents of the president. Hundreds remained camped outside the presidential palace, hoping President Morsi would cancel the decree and delay a vote on a new controversial constitution. However, tonight the president insisted that a referendum on a draft constitution will go ahead as planned next Saturday, December 15th. Critics have dismissed that referendum because they say the draft constitution does not represent a broad consensus of Egyptians and fails to enshrine universal rights for women and protect religious freedom. But tonight the president says if the constitution is not approved next week, he will order the public to directly elect a new constituent assembly to write yet another new constitution for the country. Already Egypt's liberals and secular forces have quickly rejected the president's announcement because it presses ahead with a referendum on a constitution they say will turn Egypt into a religious state.
Morsi convened a national dialogue for a breakthrough in the situation. However, main leaders of the opposition camp did not take part. Spokespersons of the Presidential National Dialogue Committee said Morsi annulled the decree. The president had issued it last month to hugely expand his power. They also said a referendum on a new constitution would be held as scheduled on December 15th. Opposition forces strongly criticised the president and Islamist-dominated Constituent Assembly for one-sidedly breaking off discussions on a draft constitution.
Some protesters in Cairo's Tahrir Square welcomed the compromise and hoped it would stop the crisis spiralling out of control. Cancelling the decree for me means preventing the bloodshed of the Egyptian people. But more opposition rallies are planned for today. And skeptics say Morsi's U-turn has only come about now that the draft constitution is finalised and has been protected from a judicial challenge.
The opposition is calling for continued protests until Morsi's government pushes back the referendum. They want a new draft constitution, one that addresses fundamental rights like freedom of speech and religion, one that doesn't impose Sharia law. But Morsi is adamant the referendum will be held on schedule. He did say, though, that if the constitution is rejected, the people would be free to elect a new constitutional committee.
With this move, Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi can certainly argue that he made a concession to the opposition, but some in the opposition already rejecting the president's argument. One opposition figure calling the president's move a joke. Let's give you some background and then explain to you what the president did on Saturday. There are two red button issues that really outraged the opposition and really sparked the protests that we've seen in Egypt over the past 2.5 weeks. One was the set of controversial decrees that he announced last month that gave him additional powers, made him immune from the judiciary until a parliament was formed. And then you had the draft constitution. The opposition said this constitution was drafted by a panel that squeezed out the liberal voices, the moderate voices. The opposition demanded the president to annul and cancel the decrees and the constitution, or at least postpone the nationwide vote on the constitution. On Saturday night, the president agreed to annul the decrees. Here's the announcement made after a lengthy meeting at the presidency.